In 2009, the United States welcomed Barack Obama as the country's commander-in-chief. Over the year, the war in Afghanistan and healthcare dominated the political debates.
For a look back at the US political year, we're joined by Professor Geoffrey Garrett. Professor Garrett is the Chief Executive of the United States Study Centre, and he joins us now from Sydney. Professor Garrett, Happy New Year and welcome.
Happy New Year to you.
Now, Barack Obama wrote The Audacity of Hope before he came to office. Do you think an appropriate title for a book after this first year would probably be Coming Down to Earth with a Thud?
Thought it might be. I think reality, the sort of grim reality that Obama faced in 2009 really was the big story of the year, beginning with the financial crisis, but obviously we've been reminded recently that the war on terrorism, even if he doesn't use that term, is still with us.
So in relation to the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq, the position is just as bad as it was a year ago and probably worse.
Yeah, in some ways that's true. Certainly in troop numbers, there are still 100,000 Americans in Iraq, and now there are going to be 100,000 in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has become Obama's war. It's not clear what the strategy is, the exit strategy is in either place. And of course, I think the real problem for Obama is that there are new countries on the agenda. We had Pakistan, we have Iran, and now in the past week, Yemen has come onto everybody's radar.
But at least his decision on Afghanistan in the last month or so, did that convince some Americans that he has got a solid strategy in relation to Afghanistan?
I'm not sure about that because it took him a long time to make the decision, and the decision he took was really a on the one hand and on the other hand decision. So on the one hand, he agreed with his generals that America needed more troops in Afghanistan, but on the other hand, he said, listen, we're going to try to get the troops out in 2011. And what critics say is if you were an insurgent in Afghanistan, now you know you've just got to wait it out for 18 months and you might be free and clear.
What about his progress on closing down Guantanamo?
Yeah, that's going to be a really interesting one, I think, in the first half of 2010 because of this Yemen-inspired Nigerian terrorist attack or thwarted attack on a US airliner last week. So Obama said he wants to close down Guantanamo, but what's he going to do? He can't really try people in criminal courts in the US, which he wants to do. Taking detainees onto American soil is going to be a really tall order, I think. And his idea of sending some of the detainees back to where they came from, including Yemen, is getting criticized right now. So unfortunately for Obama, there are just no easy decisions wherever you look.
So on security, it's been a bit of a mixed result for Barack Obama. Let's turn to climate change now. And even Barack Obama's aura and power wasn't enough to persuade the Chinese at Copenhagen to be a team player.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think US-Chinese diplomacy is really pretty intense at the moment, and behind closed doors it does fine. There are just some big differences between the US and China on climate change. The Chinese say, we can't pay for 100 years of your emissions, and the US says, listen, you're now the biggest emitter, you've got to be part of the solution. That's a tough one, but I think Obama went to Copenhagen with one hand tied behind his back because of the US Congress. Even though he's got a big Democratic majority in the Congress, middle Americans and their representatives just aren't willing for what they see, like Tony Abbott sees, as a bit of a new tax on the American people.
Now, domestically, healthcare was the big issue and a big ticket item for him. But he had to water that down for it to get any chance of being passed.
Yeah, the big story there was something that Americans call a public option. Middle America is still really concerned about government control of healthcare. They're fearful of rationing. So over the second half of 2009, Obama had to agree to take that out of the legislation that passed Congress. But I think when this legislation passes, which will probably be at the end of January of 2010, Obama will say that this is the biggest reform to American health care since Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s. And he can probably say that with some justification because about 30 million Americans who currently don't have health insurance will get it under the Obama plan.
But he still had to water it down significantly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people I know who have worked really hard on the healthcare bill don't say this is what they would have liked. What they say is, listen, this is the best opportunity we've got to do meaningful healthcare reform. We had to make a lot of compromises along the way. but just remember what we're achieving, and the achievement is adding all these tens of millions of Americans to the regular healthcare coverage part of the population. And I think for people around the world, it's just been a stunning indictment on the US that maybe up to about 50 million Americans haven't had regular access to health care. Obama's plan is going to cut into that significantly, but at an enormous economic cost and with, as you said, lots of political compromises along the way.
You talked about economic costs there. Let's turn to the global financial crisis. Now, there definitely wasn't universal approval of his handling of the response to the global financial crisis, but the American economy seems to be turning the corner now.
Yeah, it's turning the corner. I think the things to look at early in 2010 will be the job figures. So US unemployment is now over 10%, but in December it came down just a tiny amount. So let's see if that continues down. If it doesn't continue down, I think the domestic pressure on Obama is only going to increase for another kind of fiscal stimulus package, but he just doesn't have any money in the bank because the trillion became the new billion in 2009 in the US. Every time you turned around, Obama was spending $1 trillion, and the consequence is that the US is going to double its public debt burden up to about 100% of the economy by 2014. I mean, the US isn't going to be bankrupt, but its fiscal constraints, its budgetary constraints are going to be unprecedented in the next couple of years.
Back in February, did you expect that Barack Obama would have achieved more than he's done so now?
I think the hard-bitten cynics would have said he couldn't do much more than he's done, and the most important thing to do, obviously economically, was to ward off the sort of spectre of a second depression. He did that. The second thing he had to do was to try to put his mark on the war on terrorism. He did that in a few ways, by not using that term anymore, by reaching out to Muslims around the world, but obviously most importantly by making Afghanistan his war. So those were the two things, and then the third would probably have been healthcare. So on healthcare he didn't quite get to the finish line in 2009, but he might before the State of the Union address in early 2010, and that would really tie a ribbon, I think, around his first year in office.
So just finally and briefly, Geoff Garrett, he gave himself a solid B+. What do you give him out of 10 for his first year?
Yeah, great inflation, of course, is something that Americans do and Australians think is a bit strange. So maybe on an Australian scale, we'd give him a high pass or something like that, but certainly not up in the high distinction range.
Okay, thanks very much for talking to us this morning, Geoff Garrett.
You're most welcome. It was my pleasure.